You know that feeling when you're backing your truck out of a tight parking spot and some young hotshot whips around the corner doing 30 in a parking lot? Your foot finds the brake, your hands tighten on the wheel, and you think, kid's gonna learn the hard way someday. Well, when it comes to camping and predators, a lot of folks are still driving like that kid. And unlike a fender bender in a parking lot, the woods don't give you a second chance to learn from your mistakes. I'm talking to you because you've got something that 20-something with the fancy gear from REI doesn't have: perspective. You know what it means when the stakes are real. You've probably served your country, raised kids, fixed things that were supposed to be unfixable, and learned that the difference between good enough and done right can be the difference between going home and not going home. But here's the thing about camping and predator safety. A lot of what passes for common knowledge these days is either dead wrong or dangerously incomplete. And if you're like most guys our age, you learned to camp back when the woods felt different, safer somehow, more predictable. Those days are gone. The predator populations are different now. The human pressure on wildlife habitat is different. Hell, even the weather patterns are different. That system your dad taught you, or that you picked up in the service, or that worked just fine for 30 years of hunting trips, it might not be enough anymore. And that should scare you a little, because at our age, we're not bouncing back from mistakes the way we used to. A bad encounter with a black bear isn't just a story to tell at the VFW, it's potentially a life-changing event, maybe a life-ending one. But here's the good news. Everything that makes us different from that kid in the parking lot, the patience, the attention to detail, the ability to think 3 steps ahead instead of just reacting, those are exactly the tools you need to stay safe in the woods. You just need to know how to use them. See, predator safety isn't about being the toughest guy in the forest. It's about being the smartest. It's about understanding systems, reading situations, and putting in place the kind of preventative measures that keep problems from starting in the first place. It's about doing the boring, methodical work that keeps you out of exciting situations. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same approach that kept you alive when you were working with dangerous equipment, or driving in bad weather, or managing a crew where one guy's mistake could cost everyone. The woods aren't that different from a job site, really. There are hazards, there are protocols, and there are consequences for cutting corners. But unlike your old job site, the woods don't have OSHA inspectors making sure everyone follows the rules. In the woods, you are the safety manager, and the consequences of getting it wrong aren't a write-up in your personnel file. They're written in blood and fur and stories that families would rather not tell. Now, I'm not trying to scare you out of the woods. God knows we need more reasons to get outside, not fewer. What I'm trying to do is give you the kind of edge that comes from understanding how things really work, instead of hoping they work the way you think they should. I've been camping and hunting for over 40 years. I've guided city folks through country that would eat them alive if they wandered off on their own. I've tracked wounded animals in conditions where one wrong step could put me face to face with something that outweighs me by 300 pounds and doesn't particularly care about my retirement plans. And I've made mistakes, enough of them to fill a book, and enough of them to know that the difference between a close call and a tragedy often comes down to details so small you might not even notice them until it's too late. 3 years ago, I almost learned that lesson the hard way. I was camping up in northern Montana, solo trip, nothing fancy. Just wanted to get away from the noise and spend a few days fishing a creek I'd been hearing about for years. I'd been to that area before, knew the country reasonably well, figured I had everything under control. Set up camp about 200 yards from the creek, nice flat spot under some pines, good drainage, what looked like perfect campsite real estate. Followed all the basic rules I'd been following for decades. Food in the truck, fire ring clear of overhanging branches, tent positioned so I could see anyone approaching. Basic stuff, textbook stuff. Second night, I wake up to the sound of something moving around outside my tent. Now, you live long enough in the woods, you get used to night sounds. Mice, porcupines, raccoons, they all make their own kind of racket. This wasn't that. This was deliberate, methodical, something big, moving with purpose, checking out my campsite like it was shopping for groceries. I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to figure out what I was hearing, when I caught a scent that made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. Musky, wild, unmistakable, black bear, close enough that I could smell him through the tent walls. Now, I'd encountered bears before. Part of camping in bear country is knowing you might cross paths eventually. But this felt different. This bear wasn't just passing through, he was investigating. And that meant I'd made a mistake somewhere along the line. The next 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. The bear circled my tent twice, sniffed around my fire ring, spent what seemed like forever nosing around the area where I'd been cooking dinner, never touched the tent, never made any aggressive moves, but never quite left either. When he finally wandered off, I didn't go back to sleep. I spent the rest of the night thinking about what I'd done wrong, and by the time the sun came up, I'd figured it out. Actually, I'd figured out 3 things I'd done wrong. 3 small, seemingly insignificant decisions that had turned my perfect campsite into a bear buffet. And here's the kicker. I'd been making those same mistakes for years, decades, probably. I'd just been lucky enough that none of them had ever lined up in exactly the wrong way at exactly the wrong time, until they did. That's the thing about experience. Sometimes it teaches you the wrong lessons. Sometimes doing something the same way for 30 years just means you've been making the same mistake for 30 years. And in the woods, eventually, your luck runs out. But that night taught me something else, too. It taught me that the gap between experienced camper and safe camper is bigger than most of us want to admit. And it's a gap that gets more important, not less, as we get older. Because here's the brutal truth. At 60, 70, 80 years old, we're not outrunning anything. We're not fighting our way out of bad situations. We're not shrugging off injuries that would have been minor inconveniences when we were 30. Our safety margin is narrower now, which means our preparation has to be better. The good news? It can be. Because everything that age takes away in terms of raw physical capability, it gives back in terms of judgment, patience, and the kind of systematic thinking that keeps you out of trouble in the first place. You just need to know how to apply those skills to a problem that's more complex and more dangerous than it used to be. Over the next 8 parts, I'm going to walk you through everything I wish I'd known that night in Montana. Not just the obvious stuff, bear canisters and noisemakers and all the gear-heavy solutions you can buy online, but the deeper principles that determine whether you're camping safely or just camping expensively. We're going to start with understanding what you're actually up against, because most folks have no idea how predator behavior really works, or what actually attracts them to campsites in the first place. Hint, it's probably not what you think. Then we're going to talk about location. Why where you camp matters more than how you camp, and how to read terrain the way a military scout would read it, because the ground itself can be your best defense if you know what to look for. From there, we'll cover the art of building an invisible perimeter around your campsite, not talking about barbed wire or motion sensors, but about understanding how animals move and think, and using that knowledge to create barriers they'll respect without you having to enforce them personally. Food and fire management comes next, because this is where most people create the problems they spend the rest of the night trying to solve. You'll learn the cooking triangle that keeps predators interested in something other than your tent, and the 3-fire system that frontiersmen used to sleep safely in country, where grizzlies were as common as whitetails. Night protocols are their own animal entirely. What you do after dark, from how you position your sleeping area to how you handle that inevitable 2 a.m. bathroom call, can determine whether you wake up to a peaceful sunrise or something considerably more exciting. Because even with perfect preparation, sometimes things go wrong. So we'll cover crisis management, what to do when all your careful planning meets a hungry bear or an aggressive mountain lion, real protocols that work, not Hollywood nonsense. And finally, we'll put it all together into a complete system that you can adapt to any terrain, any season, any situation. A step-by-step approach that becomes as automatic as checking your mirrors before changing lanes. By the time we're done, You'll have the kind of comprehensive understanding that comes from decades of experience without having to learn it through trial and error. You'll know not just what to do, but why you're doing it and how to adapt when conditions change. Most importantly, you'll sleep better, both in the woods and at home, knowing that you've got the knowledge and skills to handle whatever the wild decides to throw at you. Because that's really what this is about. Not just staying safe, but having the confidence that comes from being prepared. The peace of mind that comes from knowing you've thought through the scenarios, accounted for the variables, and put systems in place that work even when you're tired, distracted, or dealing with conditions you didn't expect. It's about earning the right to enjoy the woods the way they're meant to be enjoyed, not as a constant source of anxiety and second-guessing, but as the refuge they've always been for men who need space to breathe and think and remember what really matters. But first, you need to understand what you're really up against out there. And I guarantee it's not what most people think. The biggest predator threat in North America isn't what you'd expect. It's not the 1,000-pound grizzly or the mountain lion that can leap 20 feet. It's something most campers never even consider. Something that's responsible for more campsite incidents than bears and cats combined. And chances are, you've been completely ignoring it for years. The predator I mentioned at the end of part 1, the one that's responsible for more campsite incidents than bears and mountain lions combined, it's not what you're thinking. It's us, human beings. Specifically, the two-legged variety that's learned that campsites are easy pickings for everything from coolers full of beer to wallets left in tent pockets. Now, I know that's not the kind of predator you were expecting to hear about. But here's the thing. If you're camping anywhere within 50 miles of civilization, human predators are statistically more likely to ruin your trip than anything with fur and claws. And the defensive strategies that work against one don't necessarily work against the other. But let's set that aside for now, because you probably already have a pretty good handle on two-legged threats. You've lived in the world long enough to recognize sketchy behavior and trust your gut when something doesn't feel right. What I want to focus on is the four-legged variety, because that's where most of the dangerous misconceptions live. And trust me, the woods are full of dangerous misconceptions. Most of them courtesy of Hollywood, the internet, and that guy at the hardware store who knows a guy who had a run-in with a bear that one time. Let's start with black bears, because they're the predator you're most likely to encounter, and the one that most people understand the least. First misconception, black bears are smaller and less dangerous than grizzlies, so they're not really a serious threat. Wrong on both counts. A mature male black bear can weigh anywhere from 250 to 600 pounds. That's roughly the size of a small motorcycle. Except motorcycles don't have 3-inch claws and the bite strength to crush bowling balls. And here's the part that should really get your attention. Black bears are responsible for more fatal attacks on humans than grizzlies. Not because they're more aggressive, but because people underestimate them. A black bear that feels cornered, threatened, or protective of its cubs is every bit as dangerous as its bigger cousin. The difference is, black bears are more likely to be in areas where people camp, more likely to have lost their natural fear of humans, and more likely to be encountered by campers who think they're dealing with something like an oversized raccoon. Second misconception, bears are afraid of humans and will avoid campsites. This used to be true 40, 50 years ago, when human pressure on wild areas was lighter and bears had more room to roam. They generally kept their distance from anything that smelled like people. But that's changed, and it's changed in ways that make camping more dangerous, not less. Modern bears, especially ones near popular camping areas, have learned that humans equal food, not because they want to eat us, but because we're slobs. We leave food scraps around our fire rings. We cook bacon and sausage and fish without thinking about how those smells travel. And we store our food in ways that a determined bear can defeat in about 30 seconds. Over time, bears in these areas have developed what biologists call food conditioning. They've learned that the weird, noisy, two-legged animals bring all the best stuff. High-calorie, high-fat foods that they can't get anywhere else. And once a bear makes that connection, all your bear spray and noisemakers in the world aren't going to convince him that your campsite isn't worth investigating. Third misconception: if you see a black bear, play dead. This is probably the most dangerous piece of bear advice floating around out there because it confuses black bear protocols with grizzly bear protocols. With a grizzly, playing dead can sometimes work because grizzlies often attack defensively and will leave you alone once they decide you're not a threat. Black bears are different. Black bears are more likely to attack predatorily, meaning they're actually considering you as food. Playing dead with a black bear is like lying down in front of a dog with a stake tied around your neck. You're not reducing the threat, you're making yourself a more convenient meal. With black bears, you want to make yourself look big, make noise, and slowly back away while facing the bear. If the bear charges, you fight back with everything you've got. Black bears will often bluff charge, meaning they'll run at you and then veer off or stop short. But if one actually makes contact, your best bet is to convince him that you're too much trouble to bother with. Now let's talk about mountain lions, because they're the apex predator that most people know the least about. Mountain lions are ghosts, phantoms. They can be 20 feet away from you in broad daylight, and you'll never know they're there. They've evolved to be perfect ambush predators, and everything about them, from their padded paws to their tan coloring to their movement patterns, is designed to let them get close to prey without being detected. The good news is that mountain lion attacks on humans are extremely rare. We're not their preferred prey, and they generally want nothing to do with us. The bad news is that when mountain lion attacks do happen, they tend to be devastating. These are animals that can leap 40 feet horizontally and 20 feet vertically. They can drag a 200-pound deer up a tree, and they're designed to kill large mammals quickly and efficiently. Here's what you need to know about mountain lion behavior. They're most active at dawn and dusk. They prefer hunting in areas with good cover and terrain features they can use for ambush, and they're attracted to anything that acts like prey. That last part is important because it affects how you move through mountain lion country. Quick, erratic movements trigger their prey drive. Running triggers their chase instinct. And anything that makes you look small, vulnerable, or injured gets their attention in ways you don't want. If you encounter a mountain lion, the protocol is similar to black bears. Look big, make noise, maintain eye contact, and back away slowly. Do not run. Do not turn your back. And if you're attacked, fight back aggressively. Mountain lions are used to prey that runs or plays dead. They're not used to prey that fights back, and often a few good hits will convince them to find an easier meal. But here's the thing about both bears and mountain lions. The vast majority of negative encounters happen because humans create the conditions that bring predators into close contact in the first place. Bears get into trouble because people camp in areas where bears are active, cook food in ways that broadcast dinner invitations across half the forest, and store food in ways that turn their campsite into a drive-through restaurant. Mountain lions get into trouble because people camp in terrain that gives cats every advantage: thick cover, elevation changes, and ambush opportunities, without taking basic precautions to level the playing field. And then there are the predators that most people never think about at all, but that can turn a peaceful camping trip into a medical emergency faster than you can say rabies shot. Coyotes, for instance. Now, coyotes generally want nothing to do with adult humans, but they've become increasingly bold in recent years, especially in areas where they've learned to associate campsites with easy food. And while a single coyote isn't much of a threat to a grown man, coyotes don't always hunt solo. Pack behavior changes the equation entirely. A group of coyotes will test boundaries, probe for weaknesses, and coordinate their approach in ways that a single animal won't. They're smart, they're adaptable, and they've learned to exploit human blind spots and behavioral patterns. The real danger with coyotes isn't a full-blown attack. That's still extremely rare. The real danger is the kind of harassment and intimidation that can turn a camping trip into a sleepless nightmare. Coyotes circling your campsite at 2 a.m., yipping and howling and testing your perimeter. Food disappearing from poorly secured areas. The constant feeling that you're being watched and evaluated. And then there are the smaller predators that can cause disproportionate problems. Raccoons, for instance, might not seem like much of a threat, but a raccoon that's learned to associate humans with food can be surprisingly aggressive and persistent. Plus, raccoons are major carriers of rabies in many parts of North America, which turns even a minor bite or scratch into a potential medical emergency. Same goes for skunks, which are actually more dangerous than most people realize. Not because of their spray, though that's unpleasant enough, but because skunks have one of the highest rabies rates among North American mammals. A rabid skunk doesn't behave like a normal skunk. It might not spray as a warning, it might be active during daylight hours, and it might approach humans instead of avoiding them. The point I'm trying to make here is that predator awareness isn't just about knowing how to handle a close encounter with a bear. It's about understanding the full spectrum of threats, from the obvious ones that everyone worries about to the subtle ones that catch people off guard. And it's about understanding that predator behavior isn't static. It changes based on season, food availability, human pressure, and individual animal experience. A bear that was easily spooked by noisemakers last summer might be much bolder this fall if it's had a summer's worth of positive experiences raiding campsites. This is where age and experience give you an advantage, if you know how to use it, because predator awareness is really just pattern recognition applied to animal behavior. And pattern recognition is something you get better at with time, not worse. You've spent decades reading situations, assessing threats, and making quick decisions based on incomplete information. You know the difference between a dog that's playing and a dog that's serious. You can tell when someone's had too much to drink just by watching them walk across a parking lot. You can sense tension in a room before anyone says a word. Those same skills apply in the woods, but you need to know what patterns to look for. Fresh bear scat on the trail means bears are active in the area, but fresh scat with undigested human food in it means you're dealing with a bear that's already learned to associate people with easy meals. Scratch marks on trees at eye level or higher mean you're in black bear territory, but scratch marks combined with large tracks, day beds, and travel corridors mean you're not just in bear territory. You're in an area that bears use regularly. Mountain lion sign is harder to spot, but it's there if you know what to look for. Deer carcasses cached in trees or heavy brush. Scratch piles, small mounds of dirt, leaves, and debris that cats use to mark territory, and the absence of other animals, because prey species know when a predator is active in an area, even if humans don't. The key is learning to read the country like a book, instead of just walking through it like tourists. Every broken branch, every track in the mud, every unusual behavior from birds or squirrels is information. And information is what keeps you safe. But even more important than recognizing predator sign is understanding what attracts predators to your campsite in the first place. Because most of the time, they're not out there actively hunting humans. They're out there looking for easy food, safe water, and comfortable habitat. And if your campsite provides any of those things, you're gonna have visitors whether you want them or not. That's why campsite location is so critical. It's not just about finding a pretty spot with good drainage and a nice view. It's about finding a spot that doesn't put you in direct competition with the locals for resources they consider theirs. And that brings us to something most camping guides never talk about: how to read terrain like a predator would read it. Because until you understand what makes a place attractive to bears, cats, and coyotes, you can't make intelligent decisions about where to set up camp. Some spots that look perfect to humans are absolute disasters from a predator safety standpoint. And some spots that look marginal or unappealing can actually be the safest places you could possibly choose. The difference comes down to understanding what predators need, what they avoid, and how they move through the landscape. And once you understand those patterns, everything else from perimeter defense to food storage to night protocols, starts to make sense. But that's a conversation that requires us to get specific about terrain, water sources, and the subtle landscape features that determine whether you're camping in the suburbs or camping in someone else's living room. You know that old saying about real estate, location, location, location? Same principle applies in the woods, except the consequences of a bad neighborhood are a hell of a lot more serious than property values. I learned this lesson the hard way about 15 years ago on what should have been a routine overnight fishing trip in Colorado. Found what looked like the perfect spot: flat ground, good drainage, close to water, sheltered from the wind. Checked all the boxes you'd find in any camping manual. What I didn't realize until about 3 a.m. was that I'd set up camp right in the middle of what amounted to a wildlife superhighway. Bears, deer, elk, coyotes. Apparently everything with 4 legs used that exact stretch of ground to move between the creek and a berry patch about a quarter mile up the ridge. Spent the night listening to a parade of animals walking within 20 feet of my tent. Nobody bothered me directly, but nobody seemed particularly concerned about my presence either, and that was the problem. When wild animals aren't concerned about you, it usually means they've got home field advantage. The thing is, animals don't choose travel routes randomly. They follow the path of least resistance, just like water. And just like water, if you understand the underlying principles, you can predict where they're going to go. This is where that military scout training I mentioned earlier comes into play, because reading terrain for tactical advantage isn't that different from reading terrain to avoid unwanted encounters. You're looking for the same things: fields of fire, cover and concealment, avenues of approach, and natural choke points. The difference is, instead of thinking about where an enemy might attack from, you're thinking about where animals naturally want to travel, feed, and rest. And instead of positioning yourself for advantage, you're positioning yourself to stay out of their way entirely. Let's start with the triangle rule, because it's the foundation everything else builds on. The triangle rule comes from old-time loggers and trappers who had to live in the woods for months at a time, often alone, always in country where grizzlies and wolves were just part of the landscape. These guys didn't have the luxury of bear spray or emergency beacons or park rangers to call for help. They had to get it right the first time, every time. The rule is simple: never camp where 3 natural features create a triangle that funnels animal movement through your area. Here's what I mean. Say you've got a creek running east-west, a ridge running north-south, and a meadow or clearing to the northwest. Those 3 features create a natural triangle, and anything moving through that country is going to be channeled into the area where those features intersect. Camp there, and you're camping in the middle of Grand Central Station for wildlife. Same principle applies to any combination of natural features that restrict animal movement. Creek and cliff face, ridge and swamp, dense timber and open meadow. Whenever geography creates a funnel, animals use that funnel, and you don't want to be in the middle of it. Now, the flip side of this is that you can use the triangle rule to your advantage by positioning yourself where you can see these natural funnels without being in them. Set up camp on slightly higher ground where you can observe the low areas where animals are likely to travel. That way, you get early warning if something's moving through your area. Plus, you get the defensive advantage of elevation. Which brings us to the high ground versus low ground question, because this is where a lot of camping advice gets it exactly backwards. Most camping guides tell you to avoid ridges and hilltops because they're exposed to wind and weather, and that's true, to a point. But from a predator safety standpoint, high ground is almost always safer than low ground. Here's why. Predators, especially large predators, prefer to hunt and travel in areas that provide cover and concealment. Thick timber, brush, creek bottoms, gullies, anywhere they can move without being easily spotted. They also prefer areas where scent and sound don't carry as far, because their hunting success depends on getting close to prey without being detected. High ground gives you the opposite of all that: better visibility in all directions. wind patterns that carry your scent away from approach routes rather than down them, and psychological advantage, because most animals, even large predators, are instinctively cautious about attacking uphill. Now, I'm not saying you should camp on a bare ridgetop in a lightning storm, but given a choice between a sheltered spot in thick timber next to a creek and a slightly exposed spot on a bench or saddle with good visibility, choose the high ground every time. The key is finding what I call defendable terrain, ground that gives you natural advantages without making you miserable. A slight rise with scattered trees for wind protection, but clear sight lines. A bench or shelf that's elevated, but not exposed. A saddle between hills that gives you visibility in multiple directions. You're looking for the camping equivalent of a good defensive position, somewhere you can see them coming, somewhere that doesn't give them easy approach routes, and somewhere you can retreat from if necessary. This is also where the 200-yard principle comes into play, and why proximity to water isn't always your friend. Every camping guide ever written tells you to camp near water. Makes sense from a convenience standpoint. You need water for cooking, cleaning, and drinking, and carrying it long distances gets old fast, especially when you're not 25 anymore. But here's what those guides don't tell you. Water sources are wildlife magnets. Everything that lives in the woods needs water, which means everything that lives in the woods visits water sources regularly. Camp too close to water, and you're camping in the neighborhood bar on Friday night. The 200-yard principle gives you a compromise. Far enough from water that you're not in the middle of the nightly parade, close enough that water procurement isn't a major logistical operation. But the distance isn't the only factor. It's also about positioning relative to how animals approach water. Most animals, especially prey species, approach water sources cautiously. They circle, they test the wind, they look for signs of predators, and they almost always approach from downwind, using cover to mask their approach until the last possible moment. This creates predictable movement patterns around water sources. There will be primary trails that animals use to approach water, usually following terrain features that provide cover. There will be secondary trails that branch off from the primary routes, and there will be areas where animals pause to assess the situation before committing to drinking. You want to understand these patterns so you can position yourself outside them. Study the approaches to your water source. Look for game trails, bedding areas, and feeding sign. Note which way the wind typically blows in the morning and evening when most animals water. Then set up camp where you're not interfering with established wildlife patterns, but where you can observe the water source without being directly in the line of traffic. This is also where seasonal considerations come into play, because animal behavior changes dramatically based on time of year and available resources. Spring camping presents different challenges than fall camping. In spring, bears are coming out of hibernation, hungry and irritable. They're looking for easy, high-calorie foods, and they're not particularly cautious about where they find them. Mother bears with new cubs are also at their most defensive, which makes surprise encounters especially dangerous. But spring has advantages too. Most prey species are spread out across the landscape, following new growth and taking advantage of abundant water. That means predator activity is also more dispersed, and you're less likely to encounter concentrated predator activity in any given area. Fall is a different story entirely. This is when bears are hyperphagia, basically eating everything in sight to build fat reserves for winter hibernation. A bear in hyperphagia can consume up to 20,000 calories a day, which means they're active almost constantly and willing to investigate any potential food source, no matter how risky. Fall is also hunting season in many areas, which adds another variable to the equation. Hunting pressure pushes animals into different patterns, often concentrating them in areas where they feel safe from human activity. If you're camping in or near these refuge areas, you could find yourself dealing with much higher wildlife density than normal. Winter camping, for those brave enough to attempt it, presents its own unique challenges. Food is scarce, which makes any potential food source extremely attractive to hungry animals. But it also makes animal activity more predictable, because they're forced to follow established travel routes between limited food sources and sheltered areas. The key to seasonal adaptation is understanding what resources are available, what animals are prioritizing, and how that affects their movement patterns and behavior. In spring, focus on avoiding areas where bears might be foraging, berry patches, meadows with new growth, and areas with winter-killed carcasses. In fall, avoid known feeding areas like oak groves during acorn season, apple orchards, and salmon runs. Also be extra cautious about food storage and cooking smells, because animals are much more motivated to investigate potential food sources. In winter, focus on areas that provide natural wind protection without creating the kind of sheltered microclimates that animals seek out for the same reason. But here's something most people never consider. The history of your campsite location can be just as important as its current features. That perfect flat spot next to the creek might be flat because it's been used as a campsite for decades. And if it's been used by humans for decades, it's probably been investigated by predators for decades. Over time, some locations develop reputations in the wildlife community as places where food can be found. This is especially true in popular camping areas, where generation after generation of bears have learned that certain locations consistently produce human food. These bears aren't just opportunistic, they're making regular patrols of known productive areas, the same way you might check your favorite fishing holes. Look for signs of previous human activity, old fire rings, tent sites worn down to bare dirt, trash that previous campers left behind. But also look for signs that wildlife has been investigating these sites. Scat near old fire rings, scratch marks on nearby trees, and what I call investigation sign, areas where animals have clearly been nosing around but not finding anything worth staying for. If you see a lot of investigation sign around old campsites, that tells you two things. First, predators know about this location and check it regularly. Second, previous campers have been sloppy enough to leave evidence that attracts wildlife attention. Either way, you probably want to find somewhere else to set up. This brings us to one of the most counterintuitive aspects of campsite selection. Sometimes the spots that look marginal or unappealing are actually the safest places you could choose. That slightly sloped area that's not quite flat enough for comfort, it might be sloped because it's not on a natural travel route, which makes it less likely to attract wildlife traffic. That spot that's a little farther from water than you'd prefer, the inconvenience of carrying water an extra 100 yards might be a small price to pay for being outside the nightly wildlife parade. That area with scattered rocks and brush that makes setting up camp more work, the extra effort might be worth it if those same features provide natural barriers that make your campsite less attractive to large animals. The key is learning to think like a predator when evaluating potential campsites, not thinking like a human who wants convenience and comfort, but thinking like an animal that's looking for easy food, safe water, and comfortable resting areas. Would this spot be attractive to a bear? Is there natural cover for approach routes? Are there terrain features that would mask the approach of a large animal until it was too late to react effectively? Would this spot be attractive to a mountain lion? Is there elevated terrain nearby that would provide ambush opportunities? Are there trees or rock formations that would allow a cat to observe the campsite without being seen? Would this spot funnel animal movement in ways that put me in the middle of wildlife traffic patterns? These are the kinds of questions that separate safe campsites from dangerous ones, and they're questions that most people never think to ask because they're focused on human comfort rather than wildlife behavior. But here's the thing, a slightly uncomfortable campsite that keeps you safe is infinitely preferable to a comfortable campsite that puts you at risk. And most of the time, the differences in comfort are minor compared to the differences in safety. Besides, at our age, we've slept in enough uncomfortable places that a few rocks under the sleeping bag aren't going to ruin the trip. What will ruin the trip is waking up to find a black bear rummaging through your gear at 2 a.m. But even with perfect campsite selection, you're only halfway to a safe camping experience. Because once you've chosen your ground, you need to set up that ground in ways that reinforce your natural advantages and minimize your vulnerabilities. And that's where most people, even experienced campers, make critical mistakes that turn safe locations into dangerous ones. You remember that scene in every old Western where the wagon train forms a circle for the night? Wagons on the outside, livestock, and people on the inside, rifles ready for whatever's out there in the dark? That's not a bad metaphor for what you're trying to accomplish with campsite defense, except you're not building a physical barrier. You're building what I call an invisible fence, a series of sensory barriers and psychological deterrents that convince predators your campsite isn't worth investigating. And just like that wagon train, the effectiveness of your defense depends on understanding both what you're trying to keep out and how it thinks. The difference is, you're not trying to stop a cavalry charge. You're trying to discourage a curious bear, redirect a hunting cat, or convince a pack of coyotes that easier opportunities exist elsewhere, which means you need to think less like a fortress commander and more like a behavioral psychologist. See, most animals, even large predators, are fundamentally conservative in their decision-making. They're looking for high reward, low risk opportunities, easy food with minimal energy expenditure and minimal danger. Your job is to make your campsite represent the opposite of that equation. This is where a lot of commercial campsite defense products miss the mark entirely. They're designed to work after a predator has already decided to investigate your site, but by then, you're already in a dangerous situation. What you want is to prevent that investigation from happening in the first place. Think of it like home security. A good security system doesn't just catch burglars after they've broken into your house. It convinces them to choose someone else's house entirely. Same principle applies in the woods. Let's start with the scent barrier, because this is your first and most important line of defense, and it's something you can build using materials you probably already have in your truck. Animals navigate their world primarily through scent. A black bear's sense of smell is roughly 7 times better than a bloodhound's. They can detect food odors from miles away, and they can read scent trails like you read road signs. This is bad news if you're creating attractive scents, but it's good news if you know how to create unattractive ones. The most effective scent barrier I've ever found isn't something you buy at an outdoor store. It's human urine, strategically applied around your campsite perimeter. Now, before you start thinking this is some kind of primitive nonsense, hear me out. Human urine contains chemical markers that most wild animals recognize as belonging to a potential threat, not because they're afraid of humans necessarily, but because they've evolved to be cautious around unfamiliar predator scents. The key is application. You're not just taking a leak wherever you happen to be standing. You're creating a deliberate scent boundary at roughly the 30-50 yard range around your campsite. Think of it as drawing an invisible circle that says, humans are active in this area. Best time to establish this perimeter is when you first arrive at your campsite, before you start cooking or setting up gear that might create attractive smells. Walk a rough circle around your intended camp area, marking trees, rocks, and other prominent features. Refresh the perimeter once more before bed, and again first thing in the morning. This works because most animals, when they encounter human scent, pause to assess the situation. They don't immediately flee, but they don't immediately investigate either. They stop, they test the wind, they look for signs of human activity. And that pause, that moment of hesitation, is often enough to redirect them along a different path. But scent barriers only work if you're not simultaneously creating attractive smells that override the deterrent effect. Which brings us to the cooking and food storage equation. Most people think about food storage as something you do after you're finished cooking and eating. But from a predator defense standpoint, food storage starts the moment you arrive at your campsite. Because every step of the food handling process, from unpacking your cooler to washing your dishes, creates scent trails that can attract unwanted attention. This is where the cooking triangle comes into play. It's a system developed by backcountry guides who regularly camp in areas with high predator activity, and it's based on separating the 3 main functions that create attractive odors: food storage, food preparation, and sleeping. Imagine your campsite as a triangle roughly 100 yards on each side. Your sleeping area goes at one point of the triangle. Your cooking and eating area goes at the second point. Your food storage area goes at the third point. The idea is to prevent any single location from becoming associated with all the smells and activities that attract predators. A bear that's attracted to cooking odors doesn't immediately encounter your food storage. A bear that finds your food storage doesn't immediately encounter your sleeping area. Now, 100 yards between points might not always be practical, especially in areas with limited flat ground or dense vegetation, but the principle still applies. Maximize the distance between these three functions, and always position your sleeping area downwind from both cooking and storage areas. The cooking area is where you do all your food prep, cooking, and eating. It's also where you clean dishes and dispose of food waste. This area will inevitably smell like food, no matter how careful you are. The goal is to contain those smells to a specific location that's well away from where you sleep. The storage area is where you keep all your food, toiletries, and anything else that might smell interesting to a bear. This includes things people don't usually think about: soap, toothpaste, deodorant, and anything that has been in contact with food. The goal is to make this area as secure and inaccessible as possible. The sleeping area is exactly that, where you sleep and keep your sleeping gear. Nothing that smells like food should ever be in or near your sleeping area. Not even the clothes you cooked in, which will have absorbed food odors even if you can't smell them. But creating separation between these areas is only half the battle. The other half is creating what I call motion triggers, early warning systems that alert you when something is moving around your campsite at night. Now, I'm not talking about expensive electronic gear or complicated alarm systems. I'm talking about simple, low-tech solutions that work reliably in all weather conditions and don't depend on batteries or signal strength. The most effective motion trigger I've found is what old-time hunters call a twig line. It's exactly what it sounds like: a line of dead branches and twigs arranged around your campsite perimeter in ways that make it difficult for large animals to move through without making noise. The key is positioning these twig lines along natural approach routes to your campsite. Study the terrain and think about how a large animal would move through your area. Where are the obvious paths of least resistance? Where are the natural openings in the vegetation? Those are the areas where you want to concentrate your twig lines. You're not trying to build an impenetrable barrier. You're trying to create enough noise that you wake up when something large is moving around your campsite. A few strategically placed branches can make the difference between sleeping through a bear investigation and waking up in time to take appropriate action. Another effective motion trigger is what I call the tent stake alarm. Take a few extra tent stakes and drive them partway into the ground along potential approach routes. Attach lightweight objects to the stakes: aluminum cans, lightweight pots, anything that will rattle when disturbed. When a large animal brushes against the stakes, the rattling will wake you up. The beauty of these systems is their simplicity. No electronics to fail, no batteries to die, no complicated setup procedures. Just basic materials creating noise when disturbed. But motion detection is only part of the equation. You also need to think about creating psychological barriers that make animals uncomfortable, even if they're not physically prevented from approaching. This is where understanding animal psychology becomes critical. Most predators, especially cats, prefer to hunt and investigate from concealment. They want to be able to observe without being observed, approach without being detected, and retreat without being followed. Your campsite design should eliminate these advantages wherever possible. Clear sightlines in all directions, minimal cover near your sleeping area, terrain features that would make a predator visible before it gets close enough to be dangerous. I'm not saying you need to camp in the middle of a parking lot, but you should think about removing or minimizing natural features that provide concealment for large animals within, say, 50 yards of your sleeping area. Thick brush that provides perfect mountain lion cover. Consider setting up camp somewhere else. Dense timber that would allow a bear to approach within 20 yards without being seen. Maybe not the ideal spot for a comfortable night's sleep. Rock formations that create blind spots and ambush opportunities, probably better appreciated from a distance. The goal is to create what military folks call standoff distance, space between you and potential threats that gives you time to react appropriately. In military applications, standoff distance is about preventing surprise attacks. In camping applications, it's about preventing surprise encounters. But all the perimeter defense in the world won't help you if your basic campsite practices are attracting predators in the first place. And this is where I see even experienced campers making mistakes that undo all their careful defensive preparations. Mistake number 1, treating your campsite like your backyard, leaving gear scattered around, food containers sitting open, trash bags accessible to investigation. In the woods, everything is a potential attractant, and everything should be secured or stored appropriately. Mistake number 2, underestimating the scent-carrying capacity of wind. That bacon you cooked for breakfast? Bears can smell it from miles away if the wind is right. Those fish you cleaned for dinner? Every predator in a 5-mile radius knows exactly where you are and what you've been up to. Mistake number 3, assuming that because you can't smell something, animals can't smell it either. Your sense of smell is roughly equivalent to a legally blind person trying to read highway signs. Just because you can't detect food odors on your hands, clothes, or gear doesn't mean they're not broadcasting dinner invitations to everything with fur and claws. This is why clothing management is such a critical part of campsite defense, even though most people never think about it. The clothes you cook in absorb food odors. The clothes you eat in absorb food odors. Even the clothes you wear while handling food packaging absorb food odors. All of those clothes need to be treated as potential attractants, which means they don't go into your tent, they don't get stored with your other gear, and they don't get left lying around your sleeping area. I keep a separate stuff sack specifically for clothes that have been exposed to food odors. At the end of the day, anything I've worn while cooking, eating, or handling food goes into that sack, and that sack gets stored with the rest of my food, well away from where I'm sleeping. It sounds like a minor detail, but minor details are what separate safe camping from lucky camping, and at our age, we can't afford to depend on luck. The other thing most people underestimate is the importance of site maintenance throughout your stay. Establishing a good perimeter defense on day 1 doesn't mean you're safe for the rest of your trip. Animal behavior changes based on weather, food availability, and their own experience with your campsite. That bear that was successfully deterred by your scent barrier on night 1 might be hungrier and more motivated on night 2. Those coyotes that showed only casual interest in your campsite initially might become more bold if they don't encounter any direct threats. This is why perimeter maintenance is an ongoing process, not a one-time setup. Refreshing scent barriers, checking motion triggers, and monitoring for changes in animal behavior around your campsite. It's also why campsite discipline becomes more important over time, not less. The longer you're in one location, the more opportunity you have to make small mistakes that accumulate into larger problems. The coffee grounds you spilled on day 1, the grease you didn't completely clean from your cook pot on day 2, the food wrapper that blew out of your trash bag on day 3. All of these create cumulative attractants that can override even the best perimeter defense. But here's the thing about all these defensive measures. They're not about creating an impenetrable fortress. They're about making your campsite less attractive than the alternatives. And in most cases, that's not a very high bar to clear. Most campers are creating attractive nuisances without even realizing it. They're broadcasting food smells, leaving accessible food sources, and providing easy investigation opportunities for curious predators. Just by implementing basic perimeter defense and campsite discipline, you're already ahead of 90% of the people camping in predator country. But even with excellent perimeter defense, you're going to face situations where predators overcome their initial caution and decide to investigate your campsite directly. And when that happens, your defensive preparations need to be backed up by smart food and fire management practices. Because once a predator has committed to investigating your campsite, your focus shifts from prevention to damage control. And damage control, especially at night, is a whole different kind of problem. There's something primal about a campfire that goes deeper than just warmth and light. Sit around a fire for more than a few minutes, and you start to understand why our ancestors built their whole lives around the hearth. Fire meant safety, comfort, civilization. Fire meant keeping the darkness, and whatever lived in it, at arm's length. But here's what our ancestors knew that we've forgotten. Fire is a tool, not a magic wand. Used correctly, it can be one of your most effective predator deterrents. Used incorrectly, it becomes a dinner bell that attracts every curious animal within miles of your campsite. The difference comes down to understanding not just how to build a fire, but where to build it, when to maintain it, and most importantly, what you do around it that determines whether it helps you or hurts you. Let's start with the three-fire system because it illustrates the kind of strategic thinking that kept frontiersmen alive in country where predators were as common as mosquitoes. The idea is simple. Instead of building one large fire that serves multiple purposes, you build three smaller fires that each serve specific functions: a cooking fire, a warming fire, and what old-timers called a guard fire. The cooking fire is where you do all your food preparation. It's positioned downwind from your sleeping area, ideally in your designated cooking zone from that triangle system we talked about. This fire burns hot and clean, designed to minimize smoke and food odors while providing sufficient heat for cooking. The warming fire is your social fire, positioned near your main camp area, where you'll spend time relaxing, talking, and enjoying the evening. This is typically the largest of the three fires, built more for ambiance and comfort than for functional purposes. The guard fire is the one most modern campers never think about, but it's arguably the most important from a predator safety standpoint. This fire is positioned between your sleeping area and the most likely approach routes for unwanted visitors. It's not meant for cooking or socializing. It's meant to create a psychological barrier that makes predators think twice about getting too close. Now I know what you're thinking. Three fires sounds like a lot of work, especially when you're trying to relax and enjoy the outdoors. And you're right, it is more work. But here's the thing about predator safety. The easy way and the safe way are rarely the same thing. The beauty of the three-fire system isn't just the deterrent effect of multiple light sources. It's the way it separates functions that can create problems when they are combined in a single location. Your cooking fire produces food smells, but it's positioned away from where you sleep. Your warming fire provides comfort and light, but it's not contaminated with food odors that might attract unwanted attention. Your guard fire provides security without the social activity that might mask approaching sounds. But even more important than the number of fires is how you manage them throughout the evening and night. Because fire behavior, how it burns, what it produces, when it dims, can have a huge impact on predator activity around your campsite. Most people let their fires burn down to coals after dinner and then add a few logs before bed, figuring they'll maintain some heat and light through the night. This creates exactly the wrong pattern from a predator safety standpoint. Here's why. As fires burn down, they produce different types of smoke and light. Fresh wood burns clean and produces steady light. But as fires die down to coals, they start producing more smoke and less light. And that combination, reduced visibility plus increased scent production, is attractive to animals that prefer to investigate under cover of darkness. The solution is something called fire banking, a technique that maintains consistent heat output while minimizing smoke production and maintaining adequate light levels. Fire banking starts with building your fire on a foundation of hardwood coals, oak, hickory, maple, anything that burns hot and clean for extended periods. On top of those coals, you arrange fresh hardwood in a specific pattern designed to maintain steady combustion without producing excessive smoke. The key is creating airflow patterns that support complete combustion while controlling burn rate. You want your fire to burn consistently throughout the night, not flare up and die down in cycles that create varying light and smoke conditions. This is where wood selection becomes critical. Soft woods like pine and fir burn hot and fast, but they also produce more smoke and sparks. Hardwoods burn longer and cleaner, but they take more effort to establish initial combustion. For fire banking, you want seasoned hardwoods split into uniform sizes that will burn predictably. Avoid green wood, which produces excessive smoke. Avoid punky or rotted wood, which burns unpredictably. And definitely avoid any wood that's been treated or painted, which can produce toxic fumes. But even perfect fire management won't help you if your food handling practices are creating problems that override your defensive measures. And this is where most campers, even experienced ones, make critical mistakes that turn safe campsites into predator magnets. The fundamental principle of safe food handling in predator country is this: every step of the food process, from unpacking to disposal, creates scent trails and attractants that can draw unwanted attention. Your job is to minimize those attractants while containing them to specific areas that are well away from where you sleep. Let's walk through a typical camp dinner and identify all the points where things can go wrong. You start by unpacking food from your cooler or storage containers. Every container that's held food has absorbed odors. Every surface that food has touched carries scent. Even the process of handling food packages transfers odors to your hands, clothes, and gear. Then you prep your food, cleaning fish, cutting vegetables, seasoning meat. Each of these activities creates waste products, scales, vegetable trimmings, packaging materials that need to be properly disposed of. They also create residual odors on cutting surfaces, utensils, and your hands. Then you cook, which broadcasts food smells downwind for miles. Bacon grease, fish oils, barbecue smoke. All of these create scent plumes that act like highway billboards advertising the location of your campsite. Then you eat, which creates more waste, food scraps, dirty plates, used utensils. Even the process of eating transfers food odors to your hands, face, and clothes. Finally, you clean up, which creates gray water contaminated with food particles and grease. Where you dispose of this water and how thoroughly you clean your cooking equipment determines how much residual scent remains in your cooking area. Every one of these steps represents an opportunity to either minimize attractants or accidentally create them. And the cumulative effect of small mistakes at each step can turn even a well-designed campsite into a predator destination. The key is developing systematic approaches to each phase that minimize scent production while maximizing containment. For unpacking and storage, that means designating specific containers for food handling and keeping those containers in your designated food storage area, not scattered around your campsite. It means washing your hands after handling any food containers, and it means never bringing food containers into or near your sleeping area. For food prep, that means doing all cutting, cleaning, and seasoning in your designated cooking area, using cutting boards or surfaces that can be thoroughly cleaned afterward. It means disposing of waste immediately in predator-proof containers, not letting food scraps accumulate around your prep area. For cooking, that means managing your heat and cooking methods to minimize smoke and grease production. High heat searing produces less scent than slow cooking methods. Grilling produces less residual odor than frying, and maintaining clean cooking surfaces reduces the buildup of attractive residues. For eating, that means being conscious of spills and crumbs. Every food particle that hits the ground becomes a potential attractant. Every greasy fingerprint on your camping chair becomes a scent source. Even something as simple as licking your fingers transfers food odors to your skin that can persist for hours. For cleanup, that means thoroughly washing all cooking and eating equipment with hot water and soap, not just rinsing them off. It means disposing of gray water at least 200 yards from your campsite. And it means changing into clean clothes after you're finished with all food-related activities. But here's where most people make their biggest mistake. They think food management ends when they're done eating. In reality, food management is a 24-hour responsibility that continues until you break camp and leave the area. That cooler sitting in the back of your truck, it's producing odors that can attract bears, even if it's supposedly bear resistant. Those dishes you washed, if they're not completely clean, they're still broadcasting food smells. That gray water you disposed of, it's creating a scent trail that leads directly back to your campsite. This is why the cooking triangle system is so important. By separating food storage, food preparation, and sleeping areas, you create multiple layers of containment that prevent any single mistake from compromising your entire campsite. But even with perfect food handling, you need backup systems for when your primary defenses fail. Because sooner or later, despite your best efforts, you're going to encounter a predator that's overcome its initial caution and decided your campsite is worth investigating. When that happens, your food storage systems become your last line of defense. And this is where a lot of commercial bear-resistant products fall short of their marketing promises. Bear canisters, for instance. They're sold as the gold standard for food storage in bear country, and they do provide excellent protection against bears that are following normal behavioral patterns. But they have limitations that most people don't understand. First, they're only bear-resistant, not bear-proof. A determined bear with enough time can defeat most bear canisters, especially if they've had previous experience with them. Second, they don't address the scent issue. Food odors still escape from even the best canisters, which means they can still attract initial investigation. Third, they provide no protection against smaller predators like raccoons, skunks, and coyotes that can't open the containers but can still create havoc around your campsite. The real value of bear canisters isn't that they're impregnable, it's that they buy you time. A bear that would demolish a regular cooler in 5 minutes might spend 20 or 30 minutes trying to get into a bear canister. And that extra time gives you opportunities to intervene before the situation escalates. But for maximum effectiveness, bear canisters need to be part of a broader food storage strategy that includes proper positioning, scent management, and backup containment methods. Proper positioning means placing canisters in your designated food storage area, not near your sleeping or cooking areas. It means choosing locations that are accessible to you, but not convenient for bears. Avoid areas near trees that bears could use for leverage, and avoid depressions or corners where bears could brace themselves while working on the container. Scent management means wiping down the exterior of containers with unscented cleaners to minimize attractive odors on the outside surfaces. It means double bagging aromatic foods inside the containers to provide additional scent containment. And it means never storing the containers in locations where spilled food or cooking odors have contaminated the ground. Backup containment means having secondary storage systems that can protect food even if your primary containers fail. This might mean storing some food in your vehicle, if regulations permit. It might mean using multiple smaller containers instead of one large container. It might mean having rope and tree skills to create elevated food caches that are inaccessible to ground-based predators. The key is redundancy. Just like you wouldn't depend on a single anchor point when climbing, you shouldn't depend on a single food storage method when camping in predator country. But all the food storage in the world won't help you if you're not prepared for the psychological reality of nighttime encounters. Because when you wake up to the sound of something large moving around your campsite at 2 a.m., your ability to think clearly and act appropriately can mean the difference between a scary story and a genuine emergency. And that's where night protocols come into play, the specific procedures and mental preparations that determine how you respond when your defensive systems are put to the test.